This program is made possible by generous contributions from viewers like you. Thank you. Let me talk to you today about justice, or more specifically about injustice. Consider the following scenario. A poor man is traveling with everything he owns, and he crosses paths with a thief who robs, beats, and threatens to kill him. The poor man has no power to fight back, and he now has nothing, putting his survival and well-being at risk, as well as that of his wife and children who depend upon him. And so the poor man pleads for 10 days with the thief to return his possessions. Truly, we should say this is an heroic effort, but to no avail. The thief will not return his property. And so, having failed to persuade the thief himself, the poor man has to try something else. He goes to see the relevant authority, the police say, or a judge, to report the theft and seek redress. But instead of helping him, the police do not even acknowledge the theft has occurred. Typical, exactly what we might expect even today. But should we? This scenario raises several crucial questions, both theoretical and practical, and the crime in question could be anything you wish: murder, sexual assaults, genocide, selling liquor to minors, or speeding in your car, literally anything. For these and any similar injustice, the questions are the same. How might the scenario have been resolved justly? What, in other words, does justice look like in this situation? What good is justice really? What are the costs of injustice? And if justice is truly valuable, what can or must the poor man do to create or bring it about? What can or must we do to create or bring it about? The tale of the Eloquent Peasant, written probably during the 11th or 12th dynasties of ancient Egypt, about 4,000 years ago, attempts to answer precisely these questions, and of course, dozens more. The poor man in our scenario is the Eloquent Peasant himself. His name is Khunanup, and he is robbed by a man named Nemtinakht, who is servant of the Chief Steward, Rensi, son of Meru. And by servant, I mean servant, I do not mean slave. The two men, Khunanup and Nemtinakht, are legally equals. Rensi, the Chief Steward, is the relevant authority to whom Khunanup appeals, and who does not respond. Among our three characters, then, Khunanup is the lowliest. Nemtinakht, legally equal, is at least sufficiently powerful to beat and rob him. He has physical power. And Rensi, the Chief Steward, is vested with the power of the state. He has political power. Khunanup lacks both the physical and political power to compel anyone to do as he wishes, and so to create justice. But relatively powerless as he is he absolutely powerless? Is there anything he can do? Is there anything that he must do? In this video, we are going to explore how the text attempts to answer these questions. I am Fabien Caillet. Welcome to Without Passage. I want to begin, as always, with a brief disclaimer. I'm not an ancient Egyptian. I'm neither an Egyptologist. I'm a philosopher. I'm totally ignorant. My concern in this video is with the arguments the text employs to demonstrate the value of justice and its implications for human life. I am much less concerned with the more complicated historical, textual, and philological issues that surround the tale of the Eloquent Peasant as a piece of literature, except where they are relevant to its argument. And they are oddly relevant in this case. However, for those interested, I have created an extensive companion video available on Patreon in which I discuss some of the more technical issues that didn't make it into this video. The link is in the description alongside, as always, suggestions for further reading. And a disclaimer, back to the tale. The tale of the Eloquent Peasant broadly makes the case that the peasant generally, and Khunanup specifically, possesses the power of argument or persuasion, and that he will be heard, even if no human alive listens to him. The text consists of 9 appeals, 9 speeches that Khunanup gives to Rensi, pleading, wailing, praising, criticizing, and even threatening, in order that the more powerful man use his power to create justice and put right what is wrong. These speeches are stitched together into an overall narrative by the author, and it is predominantly from this narrative, and not simply from the speeches, that the text becomes meaningful. See, Khunanup's speeches are presented to the reader from a different perspective than the narrative into which they are set. Khunanup's speeches are, of course, Khunanup's. They arise from his perspective and are sensitive to his situation and his concerns. The narrative, however, is supplied by the omniscient author, who at least pretends to be a scribe of some variety, privy to court conversations between the chief steward, Rensi, his officials, and ultimately the pharaoh. I'll return later to the implications that this perspective switching has on the meaning of the text, but for now I have to mention that it reveals something crucial for the context of the events it depicts. I have already explained Khunanup's situation and the reason he has come to speak with Rensi. I have also already mentioned that Rensi does not reply to Khunanup, at least not until the end of the text. I have not said why Rensi does not reply, and that is important context going forward. As far as Khunanup knows, Rensi refuses to reply to him because he is callous, because he does not care about Khunanup himself, or because he is greedy and Nemtinakht has paid him off, or even that Nemtinakht has committed his theft on behalf of Rensi himself. Khunanup can only guess that Rensi is at best indifferent to his suffering, and at worst a party in it. But the reader is told specifically why Rensi does not answer him, and it is nothing at all like what Khunanup might expect. Rensi is so impressed by Khunanup's eloquence that he wishes to keep him speaking by any means necessary. And that means that he cannot yet acquiesce to or even acknowledge his demands. Now, this may not be as bad as being party to the theft or indifferent to it, but it is still shitty, right? And it doesn't help much that Rensi schemes with his officials and even the pharaoh to secretly provide for Khunanup and his family while he continues to make his speeches. Khunanup himself is unaware of these maneuvers. He still thinks that Rensi ignores or approves of the injustice of which he complains, and this is so purposely. And in response, Khunanup spirals further and further into despair. Rensi doesn't appreciate Khunanup as a person. Khunanup is nothing but cheap entertainment for him, and he certainly doesn't warrant, as far as Rensi is concerned, timely compassion or redress. This is all just to say that ACAB applies also to ancient Egyptian stewards too, apparently. And this is important context for the speeches Khunanup gives and for the ultimate meaning of the text. So with that, let me transition to those speeches. Now, I'm not going to go through each speech in order here. They are composed elliptically, and each speech treads similar argumentative ground as the others. If I were to go through each speech in order, this video would be incredibly redundant, incredibly long, and also, I think, quite dull. You don't want that, and I want you to be at least minimally happy. Press the like button, do whatever you want. I do encourage you, though, this is the more important thing, to pull up a good translation and read through them. They are amazing speeches alone, let alone bound together into a single work of literature, and the narrative really does add something to it. The Lichtheim translation is, of course, a classic, probably the most classic, and the more recent translation by Parkinson is really good, too, as is his commentary. I really like the translation by Lauren Fisher, which comes in a neat little volume all by itself, if that's the kind of thing you want, but they're all readily available. Anyhow, my focus in this video is on several repeated themes that Khunanup developed throughout his speeches. These are Khunanup's answers to the questions I mentioned earlier. What is justice, both generally and particularly? What are the costs of injustice and value of justice? What can be done when one's pleas for justice go unheard? Let me begin with the first. Justice for Khunanup and for the author of the tale is a complex kind of balance. That is what justice means in ancient Egypt. It is firstly a balance between competing interests in a polity in order to reduce conflict and promote social order. We are, of course, familiar with this element of justice in today's political theory. Liberal theorists such as Hobbes, Locke, Le Boétie, etc. have argued for nearly 500 years now. Rawls, even Nozick to some degree. They've argued that it is the essence of justice. For Khunanup, however, it is merely one part and not its essence. Justice, on his view, is also a balance between an individual's role in the community and the compensation they receive, to put it simply. I mean by this a few different but intimately related and mutually reinforcing things. The first is the justice of each individual's social interaction. Someone does this, someone else does that, and those two actions taken together are just if their value is in some sense balanced. It's tit for tat, eye for an eye, you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of shit. The second is the justice of each individual interpersonal relationship, or the sum total of the interactions between a set of individual people. the kind of relationship that one ought to have to one's father, for example, as a father, or one's wife, one's neighbor, shopkeeper, court official, king, etc. Third, and finally, is the justice of one's individual social station or social position, the sum total of all of one's interpersonal relationships. For it is in this sense what is due to a person and demanded of them on the grounds of what role they play in the overall community, and this is particularly what this text is concerned with. And at this level, people can be roughly distinguished into different classes of people by the kinds of relationships and interactions they are likely to have. A peasant is likely to know other peasants, shopkeepers, farm animals, their wives, merchants, etc., and unlikely to know scribes and diplomats. And so justice for them is appropriately different from justice for a court official who is likely to know scribes and diplomats, but unlikely to know shopkeepers, farm animals, and so on. And purposely so very often. And as such, any account of justice built on these kinds of concerns appears to us today as conservative, and is indeed promoted by self-identified conservative political theorists, specifically because it justifies or makes just social hierarchy. But while we are inclined to believe that this balance of competing interests in a polity, a liberal concern, and this balance of duties and compensation, a conservative concern, stand in tension with one another, neither Khunanup nor the author of the tale of the Eloquent Peasant show any sign of recognizing any such tension. And indeed, they explicitly argue that these two elements of justice reinforce one another. That, in other words, a person receiving in proportion to their giving is essential to balancing their interests with others in a community, and vice versa. Khunanup's first speech makes a quick pass at how this works. He praises Rensi as great and powerful, and not only great and powerful, but the greatest of the great and powerfulest of the powerful, most powerful of the powerful. He tells him that when he goes down to the Lake of Justice, he will sail on it with good wind, no disaster will befall him, and he will not fear, because, and I'm roughly quoting here, you are father to the orphan, husband to the widow, brother to the abandoned, and cloak to the motherless. That because is important. Rensi is compensated with ease and leisure because he is possessed with political power and plays an important social role by means of it. And the role he serves is to adjudicate disputes and care for those who are not possessed of the power to care for themselves. He is, in other words, charged personally with the responsibility of balancing competing interests in his polity. And because this is his responsibility, Khunanup has come to him as a suppliant, as someone whose interests have been violated. He asks Rensi, the chief steward, to permit him to praise his name in accordance with every good law, as a great man unpolluted by greed and vice, who destroys injustice, creates justice, and listens to the oppressed. Listen then to me, he says, at the end of his first appeal. I am oppressed. I am in need. Lift my burden from me. But when Rensi does not listen to him, as far as he is aware, and does not lift his burden, this is when he really develops his account of justice to include Rensi as its subject and not only its master. Although Rensi is charged with balancing competing interests, these interests include his own, which may sometimes compete with others. And as far as Khunanup knows, Rensi's interests do compete, at least with his. And so he must convince Rensi to sacrifice something of his own to rule justly. His subsequent appeals aim primarily at this end, at persuading Rensi that he is duty-bound to create justice, even at the expense of his own immediate personal advantage. The basic argument Khunanup employs is this. Despite any immediate advantage Rensi might receive from refusing to create justice in this specific case, there is a greater benefit to his justice and more significant cost to his injustice. If he wishes to acquire this benefit and avoid this cost, then he must create justice and so use his power to compel Nemtinakht to return Khunanup's property. And he must wish to acquire this benefit and avoid this cost once he fully understands what they are. Understanding them makes it impossible not to want them. Justice in this sense is a person's ultimate advantage, and that depends upon the demands placed upon them within their polity. Rensi's ease and leisure are purchased at the cost of wisely, fairly adjudicating disputes, and they can be removed from him if he does not pay this cost. In Rensi's case, then, it is immediately clear how Khunanup's account of justice unifies the balance between competing interests in a polity and the balance between what is given and what is received. Rensi's role, what he gives to a polity, is precisely the balance of competing interests within it, and he receives in proportion to his performance of that role. And this is made ever more clear when we reflect upon the historical context of this argument, especially since Khunanup is not discoursing abstractly, as is so common among more recent philosophers, but composes his account of justice in response to the specific conditions of his own life and community, that is, as the victim of injustice. Allow me then a slight digression concerning the historical context of the tale of the Eloquent Peasant to further emphasize what is really at stake in this argument and what it means for the nature and value of justice. While the tale of the Eloquent Peasant was written in the 11th or 12th dynasty, its dramatic date was substantially earlier, during the 9th dynasty of the First Intermediate period, about 100 to 200 years earlier. Egypt was then divided between several kingdoms, each much weaker than the old kingdom that preceded them, and each aspiring nevertheless to once again unite the whole of Egypt under their authority. There is some evidence to suggest, apparently, although don't quote me on this, that the average Egyptian peasant lived a better life during the First Intermediate period than either the old kingdom that preceded it or the middle kingdom that succeeded, and almost certainly because a king, governor, or steward who holds on to power more tenuously has to take greater care to ensure that their peasants are loyal. A peasant, in other words, maintains a greater negotiating position, metaphorically speaking, when the powerful are less powerful. But while this may be true, in fact, it isn't quite the imagined state of affairs among those elite figures themselves who have a hand in authoring documents such as the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, and their documents regularly reflect this, which is why we have a very different narrative about the nature of the First Intermediate period. As they have it, and so as Khunanup argues, the ruler, their wisdom, and their justice are the source of the peasants' welfare and prosperity. And they and he are not entirely wrong either. Khunanup is not merely flattering Rensi when he says this. Peasants do not, of course, strictly negotiate for their welfare in ancient Egyptian society. A wise ruler merely knows that they need to ensure that their subjects do not revolt or defect, and so eases taxation and other public requirements, offers greater protections in case of famine, illness, and violence, and makes themselves more available for the sake of other requests, whatever they happen to be. While it remains popular among historians today to emphasize the political agency of the peasantry, a long tradition going back to the Germans, the fact is that the rulers serve as a sort of bottleneck through which political agency flows. Nearly all effective political agency in ancient Egypt, in other words, resides with the ruler, and their excellence dictates a great deal about the fate of the peasantry to whom they are entrusted. If they are just, no one, no peasant, no soldier, no priest, no public official, no provincial governor, has any legitimate complaint or leverage to use against them. If they are unjust, at least someone has reason to rebel, and where there is one, there shall soon be another, then another, then another, then another, then another, until the ruler's grasp on power slips completely. For Khunanup, a correct account of justice is derivable from this simple fact, from the fact that is that the justice of a ruler is the source of political order. Justice is manifest as he has it when everyone lives free of resentment and fear, and is therefore permitted to pursue their own interests and meet their own obligations without much difficulty. This requires two key things, both provided by a ruler such as Rensi, at least ideally. First, that when interests do come into conflict, as will invariably happen, there is some reliable and trustworthy means of resolving disputes. And this means of resolving disputes must itself possess at least two characteristics. It must be possessed of some authority over the disputants. Khunanup himself and Nemtinakht are social equals and cannot resolve their disputes themselves. The text illustrates this by emphasizing that Khunanup pleads with him for 10 days, a whole week by the ancient Egyptian calendar, probably reflecting some customary or legal requirement on his part. And if Nemtinakht will not listen to Khunanup, he of course has no reason to listen to some other peasant, as just as they may be, or even a woman, child, or slave. Any means of resolving disputes between two individuals must have the authority to actually resolve those disputes. Further, this means of resolving disputes cannot simply stand over disputants, but must also be sensitive to their condition, their interests, and their capabilities. Nemtinakht is of course a perfect example here, but Khunanup, ever just, speaks more generally. He gives the example of a poor man stealing as compared to a wealthy man. The poor man is beyond reproach in this instance because their life and livelihood depends upon their theft, at least hypothetically. If their theft is punished without providing for them alternate means of securing the needs of life, they are condemned to a persistent condition of fear, resentment, and vulnerability. The wealthy man is not in a similar position. Their theft is needless, and deciding against them does not foster fear or resentment in the same way, and certainly not vulnerability. Second, the results of this means of resolving disputes must also be reliably and effectively enforced. It is one thing to decide that the wealthy man is wrong to commit his theft, and quite another to suitably punish him. It is no surprise that this is Khunanup's main concern throughout his speeches, as he seeks redress for injustices done to him. But it is also a key concern for justice generally. Khunanup argues that punishment is essential to justice because it is truly how Rensi creates it. If Rensi does not punish Nemtinakht or anyone else for beating and robbing him, then he gives his tacit approval. Overlook one injustice, he says, and it will become two. Others, like Nemtinakht, are encouraged to act as he does. What consequence can come to them? They have learned from Nemtinakht that the Chief Steward does not punish injustice. And if he does punish them, but not Nemtinakht, then that too is injustice. And this is even before we consider a ruler's position not simply as the supreme political agent, but as the most visible and most revered moral exemplar. If he permits theft, then theft must be an acceptable means of making a living, and so more and more peasants are robbed of their goods and die in poverty. Resentment grows within the kingdom, and everyone becomes more and more vulnerable. Their life and their power become more and more tenuous. Whosoever, Khunanup laments, now sleeps until dawn, travels by day, and defends his own good cause. Justice is the breath of life, but justice uncreated itself creates injustice. Justice undone itself does injustice. It is every person's responsibility to pursue their own interests justly, to play their role in society without, as far as possible, causing conflict with others. But a peasant's justice does not, of course, protect him against injustice. Khunanup is proof enough of this. Although his path is good, as he says, Nemtinakht still beats and robs him. It falls therefore to authorities such as Rensi to protect the just by means of their own justice. And unlike all of their subjects, the ruler is in fact protected by their justice precisely because all those under their authority act harmoniously together, because he is the source of justice. This is why the just ruler sails free and easy upon the lake of justice. Neither disaster nor rebellion shall befall them. Their sails are filled by servants joyously fanning them with palms, if by nothing else. But this is also why the justice of the ruler is so important. For as Khunanup emphasizes, a bad ruler is even worse than no ruler at all. His leisure are symbols to others. He is a leader not only in the sense that he is possessed of the authority and agency to act, but also in the sense that he sets the example and the standard of right action within his polity. But because the ruler is the highest authority, and because they rightly maintain a monopoly on violence, how can their justice be ensured? Throughout his 9 appeals, Khunanup refers subtly to violence, rebellion, and conflict. As he ends his final appeal, for example, he says that there is no yesterday for the negligent, no friend for one deaf to justice, no good day for the covetous. The accuser becomes wretched, the wretched becomes plaintiff, and the enemy becomes killer. The message is clear. The unjust ruler will be dealt with, one way or another. During and immediately following the first intermediate period, this was a real threat. Warfare and rebellion were constant. At least they were constant threats. And Rensi's own region was overrun and conquered some decades after the dramatic date of the tale by the kingdom of Upper Egypt, whom the kings of Lower Egypt considered rebels. Khunanup himself, however, makes no indication whatsoever that he would ever support violence or rebellion of this kind. He emphasizes throughout his appeals the power of his voice, that he is one who calls, who complains, who wails and weeps, and who was otherwise powerless. But while we might disregard the voice of the powerless, Khunanup asserts that Rensi must not. Now my body was full, he says, my heart was burdened. Justice spilled from my body because of this condition. Like the breach of a dam whose water flows out, so my mouth opened to speak. I bailed out my water, expelling what was in my body, and washed my linens clean. There's a lot of mixed metaphors here. My speech has been completed. My misery has come before you. Now what more do you need? Later, in his 8th appeal, his second last, he complains that Rensi did not pay him for his good speech, which comes from the mouth of Re himself. And finally, at the end of his 9th appeal, his last one, after enduring then for 10 days Rensi's silence, he resolves to go to an even higher authority than Rensi. Look, he says, I plead with you, but you do not hear. I will go and plead concerning you with Anubis. Khunanup importantly means protected by Anubis, Khunanup. And he means here that he is going to unalive himself, quite literally, and tell Anubis, the god of the dead, to punish Rensi for failing to heed his pleas and create justice himself. Unlike human rulers, the gods are perfectly just. Where Rensi does not hear his pleas, Anubis will, and he will create justice, punishing Rensi in proportion to his injustice. And with the gods at the top of all hierarchies both of physical and political power, they are, after all, masters of nature too, Khunanup and the author of the tale of the Eloquent Peasant beyond him finally complete their account of justice. The community, ordered justly, is a pyramid. At its bottom are children who serve and are protected by their mothers, who serve and are protected by their peasant husbands, who serve and are protected by stewards, who serve and are protected by pharaohs, who serve and are protected by their gods. The just relationship up and down the pyramid is one and the same. It is one of love, true love, and not domination. If Rensi were just, he would love Khunanup and wish the best for him. He would listen to his pleas and retrieve what was stolen. And the same applies also to Nemtinakht. If Rensi were just, he would love Nemtinakht too. He would not wish to see him succumb to vice, to become a thief and cause conflict with his neighbors. And through justice, then, Rensi creates throughout his polity strong bonds of kinship which strengthen it, which ward off rebellion, and which foster even a peasant's well-being. That's what it means for a ruler to be the source of justice. This all sounds good, does it not? Perhaps even too good. We must, as always, keep in mind why a document such as this might have been written. Especially in more ancient times when writing was costly and difficult, a text will serve several interests concurrently. It will, of course, enlighten and entertain, but it will also serve in some way the political interests of its author. Now, we should not collapse Egyptian ideology into a single cohesive whole and mutilate and torture a text until it cries out the same ideology in desperation. We must afford a text its own right to speak. But in doing so, we must nevertheless recognize its motivation for speaking at all, and these are at least partly political. And here there are several very salient facts about the text that we inherit. It was composed during the Middle Kingdom, after Upper Egypt defeated, conquered, and consolidated Lower Egypt. It follows a peasant rather than an aged king or other wise court official. That peasant harshly criticizes the authorities of Lower Egypt. But ultimately those authorities decide in his favor and appear to give him not only those goods that Nemtinakht stole from him, but his choice of all of Nemtinakht's property. That is seriously how the text ends. Ridiculous. That the tale is set in Lower Egypt may not then be a coincidence. The Middle Kingdom saw an explosion of instruction texts aimed at notable Lower Egyptian kings and rulers, those, again, whose successors were defeated. The aim appears to be one of two possibilities. First, an author may attempt by writing an instruction text to indirectly instruct the living pharaoh, his successors, or other court officials, while ensuring their own safety. It is much safer to tell a ruler how his enemies rule badly than how he does, even if by saying so you influence how one's own ruler rules. We, of course, still do this today all the time. Look at those disgusting Swedes and their terrible policies. We in Norway would never govern ourselves like that. For example. I live in Canada. Our politics are nothing but looking south and pretending to distinguish ourselves from the Americans, and I can only imagine that Norwegians do the same. Perhaps they're more enlightened, or perhaps they even still compare themselves to Americans. Anyway, second, an author may attempt to legitimize the current regime, arguing, essentially, that we govern well and according to this sage advice. Those vanquished tyrants from Lower Egypt were given this advice, but out of greed or malice they ignored it. Our victory over them was then their punishment from the gods. And quite possibly, an instruction text may attempt to accomplish both of these aims at once, presenting a different message to a different audience. Because the traditional role of the sage, the teacher, is filled not by a respected authority, but by a peasant, some Egyptologists argue that the tale of the Eloquent Peasant is in some way a parody of other instruction texts. That, basically, the elite audience of the text cannot help but disregard or invert Khunanup's argument precisely because it comes from a man such as him, lowly as he is. And there is, of course, some indication of that. Rensi's officials basically make that argument to him. But in addition to that, the instruction to Merakare, for example, suggests that because the poor man is powerless and vulnerable, he speaks only to ensure his own advantage, and so cannot speak dispassionately, fairly, truly, and of course, justly. If this is true, Khunanup's speeches concerning justice must be read as serving his own advantage, and not justice itself, undermining their validity. He attempts to persuade Rensi about the nature of justice, not because he is right about justice, or because it is just for Rensi to believe that he is right about justice, but because if Rensi agrees with him, then Khunanup himself benefits, even if unjustly. This is a deeply cynical view, I must emphasize, but it was a common one, and it would later be weaponized against especially slaves, such that their testimony about any such matter could be legally admitted only if it was extracted through torture. But that was a later time, and it was not, however, a universal opinion among authors of ancient Egyptian instruction texts. The instruction of Ptah-tep, for example, says, "Do not be high-minded because you are educated. Rather, consult with the simple as much as the educated. The perfection of no art can be achieved. No artist is equipped with their fulfillment. Wise words are rarer than malachite, yet found among girls at the grindstone." All three of these texts are roughly contemporaneous. There was some disagreement, clearly, about the wisdom of peasants. At the very least, this implies that the tale need not be a parody, although it still might be. And although I am, to repeat again, no Egyptologist, and totally ignorant to the subtleties of Egyptian textual analysis, I see no clear textual evidence of irony or of anything that is not wholly amenable to the regime of the Middle Kingdom. It indeed further serves any propagandistic aim a Middle Kingdom author might have in support of the regime to portray a lower Egyptian ruler being justly harangued by a mere peasant. That is delicious schadenfreude, if nothing else, and it seems to me even more than this, since by switching perspectives as it does, it portrays Rensi as unjust, as caring little about Khunanup's plight, or even Nemtinakht's. Let us not forget that in response to Khunanup's petition, he at least potentially condemns Nemtinakht to a life of poverty and desolation. Is this just? And even if we might think so, it certainly isn't according to Khunanup's speeches. With the propagandistic aim of its author clearly in view, then, we should take care to evaluate whether their argument is sound, whether, that is, justice truly is as Khunanup says, and for the reasons he says it is. That the text is propaganda should not so much count against it. Probably every significant historical text that survives is propaganda, strictly speaking, and this very video may be too. And I do invite you to discover my aims if you can. But the propagandistic element of a text can point us toward aspects of it to take more seriously than others. The tale attempts to persuade its reader that justice is a balance, first between competing interests in a polity, and second between one's role in the polity and one's reward. This balance, in both cases, is one and the same. The balance between competing interests can be achieved only where there are superiors and inferiors, the latter serving the former, and the former holding all political agency and so resolving disputes amongst the latter. The balance between one's role and reward can then be achieved only by allotting superiors appropriate power and privilege to resolve disputes and punish injustice, while depriving inferiors of that same power. This is precisely the kind of thing a newly ascendant regime might want its subjects to believe. We, the Kingdom of Upper Egypt, have finally reasserted the just political order in Lower Egypt, and by doing so we preserve our title to all effective political agency, alienating you, our subjects, from it. But we do this for your own good, for your own security, for your own welfare. Such is the nature of justice. And we, of course, stay open to you to merely speak, to persuade us, and if not, to persuade the gods. While we are not typically so friendly today to such strict political hierarchy, there is definitely something to Khunanup's argument here. How do equals resolve disputes and enforce a resolution? The whole course of human history shows that the most important disputes are most often resolved by force, if we can really call that a resolution. Although human beings regularly resolve disputes by deliberation and consent, this has been the exception and not the rule for over 10,000 years, except perhaps for trivia. And if equals are frequently exercising force against one another, or even if they have the freedom to do so, few shall have the means and the security to live well. Khunanup resolves this problem by emphasizing the necessity of political authority, of that which maintains a monopoly on violence, to be a means of resolving disputes among those who do not have political authority. This is all well and good, at least hypothetically. Our own societies are structured according to this same logic, for better or worse. But there is one key difference here. In a liberal political order, even the powerless have at least some means of legally checking the power of our authorities. Our rulers are at least theoretically accountable to those they rule. We can protest, we can campaign, we can sue, we can vote, and so on. What means are available to Egyptian peasants? If you are possessed of extraordinary eloquence, as Khunanup is, you may persuade your authorities to side with you in a dispute. But as R.B. Parkinson emphasizes, even if that's the case, what about those who are not so possessed? What can they do? G.K. Jeffers has argued that this apparent lack of clear means of holding political authorities to account within the tale of the Eloquent Peasant invites its reader to interpret it as a revolutionary text, as an argument against the existing political order and in favor of a more egalitarian polity. But it must be emphasized here that Khunanup explicitly says how rulers are held accountable, because he says how he plans to hold Rensi accountable. Just as he goes from Nemtinakht up the pyramid to Rensi, he threatens to go from Rensi up the pyramid to Anubis. If there is some accessible authority who is necessarily just, the gods in this case, then what need is there for revolution and greater equality, especially when, first, unjust violence is the subject of explicit lament, and second, political equality just doesn't solve the central problem of the text, the dispute between Khunanup and Nemtinakht. The meaning of the text is clear in its own terms. It isn't revolutionary. The question, however, is the lesson we might take from it today. Should we, in line with Jeffers' revolutionary interpretation of the tale, seek some means of holding our rulers accountable in this life? Or should we sacrifice our lives, trusting that we shall be vindicated by the God's judgment? That is for us to decide.